The entire restaurant went silent when the waitress stepped between an old woman and the angry manager. In the city, and nobody knew that her son was about to walk through those doors. But before we begin, if you believe kindness should never depend on someone's wealth, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because this story may remind you why one small act of courage can change a life forever. The rain had been falling since early morning, leaving the streets outside the elegant Riverside Grand Hotel shining beneath the gray afternoon sky. Inside, everything looked polished and expensive. Crystal lights hung from the ceiling, silverware rested perfectly beside white plates, and well-dressed customers spoke quietly over expensive meals. Among the employees moving quickly between tables was 26-year-old Emily Carter. Emily had worked at the restaurant for almost 3 years. She was not the fastest waitress, nor did she have the most impressive background, but she had something her coworkers often noticed: she remembered people. She remembered how Mr. Wilson liked his coffee without sugar. She remembered that Mrs. Bennett always asked for extra napkins. She remembered which customers were celebrating birthdays and which ones preferred a quiet table away from the entrance. And she always treated the elderly customers with special patience. Emily understood something that many people forgot: everyone eventually becomes old. Her own grandmother had raised her after her mother passed away when Emily was a teenager. Her grandmother used to tell her, "Emily, never measure a person by the clothes they wear. You never know what kind of heart is hiding behind a tired face." Emily carried those words everywhere. That afternoon, shortly after 3 o'clock, the restaurant doors opened and an elderly woman slowly stepped inside. She looked around nervously. She was probably in her 70s. Her silver hair was tied neatly behind her head, and she wore a simple blue coat that had clearly seen better days. Her shoes were clean but worn, and she carried a small brown handbag close to her chest. She stood near the entrance for several seconds, apparently unsure where to go. Emily approached her with a warm smile. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Welcome. Would you like a table?" The old woman smiled shyly. "Yes, please. Somewhere quiet, if possible." Of course. Emily led her to a comfortable table near the window. The woman sat down carefully and looked through the menu. After a few moments, she called Emily over. "I'm sorry to bother you." "You're not bothering me at all." The woman lowered her voice. "Could I just have a cup of tea and perhaps a small bowl of soup?" "Absolutely." The woman hesitated. "And, may I stay here for a little while after I finish?" Emily smiled. "You can stay as long as you like." Something in the woman's eyes softened. "Thank you." Emily walked away, unaware that those simple words meant more to the woman than she could possibly imagine. Her name was Margaret Lewis. For years, Margaret had been known by another name in business circles: the mother of Daniel Lewis, the founder and CEO of Lewis International, a global company worth billions. But Margaret never introduced herself that way. She hated using her son's name to receive special treatment. She had always believed that if people were kind to her only because they knew who her son was, then their kindness meant nothing. That was why she had come to the restaurant alone. She simply wanted a quiet place to sit. Emily brought her tea and soup. Margaret thanked her warmly. As Emily turned away, Margaret quietly said, "Young lady." Emily looked back. "Yes, you have a very kind face." Emily laughed softly. "My grandmother used to say the same thing." Margaret smiled. "Then your grandmother must have been a wise woman." She was. Emily returned to work. For nearly 40 minutes, Margaret sat peacefully by the window. Then everything changed. The restaurant manager, Richard Blake, entered the dining area. Richard was 45 and known among the staff for being obsessed with appearances. He believed every customer should look wealthy, every table should look perfect, and every employee should move as if they were being watched by cameras. He noticed Margaret immediately. His expression changed. He walked toward her table. "Ma'am." Margaret looked up. "Yes." Richard glanced at her nearly empty table. "You've been sitting here for quite some time." Margaret nodded. "I'm sorry. I'm almost finished." Richard looked around. "This is a busy restaurant." Margaret glanced toward the nearly empty tables. "I understand. You ordered the least expensive item on the menu." Her face tightened. "I only wanted something light." Richard leaned closer. "If you're finished, perhaps you could leave so we can prepare the table." Margaret looked embarrassed. "I was waiting for the rain to slow down." Richard sighed impatiently. "There's a lobby downstairs." Margaret slowly picked up her handbag. "I can leave." At that moment, Emily saw what was happening. She hurried over. "Mr. Blake, I can take care of the table. Richard looked at her. This isn't your concern. Emily remained calm. She hasn't caused any trouble. Richard frowned. She has occupied a table for almost an hour with one bowl of soup. Emily glanced at Margaret. She said she was waiting for the rain. Richard lowered his voice. And I said she needs to leave. Margaret stood. Please, don't argue because of me. Emily gently touched the back of the chair. You don't have to leave. Richard stared at her. Excuse me. Emily swallowed, but she stood her ground. She's a customer, and she hasn't broken any rules. Richard's face became red. You're challenging me in front of customers. No, sir. Yes, you are. Margaret looked increasingly uncomfortable. Please, she said softly. I don't want any trouble. Richard turned toward her. Then perhaps you should have thought about that before coming here. Several customers stopped talking. Emily's heart tightened. There was something cruel about the way Richard spoke to the old woman. It wasn't merely about the table. It was about making her feel small. And Emily could not tolerate it. She stepped between them. Sir, I think that's enough. The restaurant became completely silent. Richard looked at her as though she had just committed the greatest offense imaginable. What did you say? I said that's enough. You're fired. Emily froze. Margaret looked shocked. Please don't fire her. Richard ignored her. You think you can embarrass me in front of customers? Emily's voice trembled, but she didn't step back. I'm not trying to embarrass you. I just think she deserves to be treated respectfully. Richard pointed toward the kitchen. Go. Emily stood still. Sir. Go now. She looked at Margaret. The elderly woman had tears in her eyes. Emily quietly said, Are you okay? Margaret nodded. You've done enough. Emily gave her a small smile. Then she turned toward the kitchen. But before she could take another step, the restaurant doors opened. A tall man in a dark charcoal suit entered. He was 38 years old. His hair was neatly styled, his expression serious, and two assistants followed a few steps behind him. The man stopped. He looked across the restaurant. Then his eyes landed on Margaret. His entire expression changed. Mom. Margaret slowly turned. Her face went pale. Daniel. The man walked toward her. Mom, what are you doing here? Margaret looked embarrassed. I just wanted some tea. Daniel noticed the tears in her eyes. His smile disappeared. Why are you crying? No one did anything. Richard suddenly stepped forward. Mr. Lewis, welcome. I'm Richard Blake, the restaurant manager. Daniel barely looked at him. Why is my mother crying? Richard froze. Your mother, Margaret whispered. Daniel, please. But Daniel was already looking at Emily. Then he looked at Richard. What happened? Richard swallowed. There was a small misunderstanding. A misunderstanding? Yes. Your mother was occupying a table for quite some time, and I simply asked her to move to the lobby. Daniel stared at him. My mother? Yes, sir. Daniel looked around the restaurant. His voice became quiet. This restaurant is owned by my company. Nobody moved. Richard's face lost its color. Daniel continued. I purchased this hotel 18 months ago. Richard looked terrified. You own Lewis International. Daniel nodded. Yes. Emily stood near the kitchen entrance, stunned. She suddenly realized that the elderly woman she had defended was not just an ordinary customer. She was the mother of the billionaire CEO whose company owned half the buildings in the business district. Daniel turned toward Margaret. Mom, tell me exactly what happened. Margaret shook her head. It doesn't matter. It matters to me. She looked at Emily. She defended me. Daniel turned. Who? Margaret pointed toward Emily. That young woman. Emily looked down. I just did what I thought was right. Daniel walked toward her. What's your name? Emily Carter. Emily, did my mother tell you who she was? No, sir. Did you know she was related to me? No. Daniel looked at his mother. Margaret smiled through her tears. She didn't care. Daniel looked back at Emily. And for the first time that day, his expression softened. That is exactly why I need to thank you. Emily shook her head. You don't have to. I do. Richard stepped forward nervously. Mr. Lewis, I apologize. I didn't know. Daniel turned toward him. That is the problem. Richard stopped. Daniel's voice remained calm. If you had known she was my mother, would you have treated her differently? Richard couldn't answer. Daniel looked around the restaurant. My mother should never receive respect because she is my mother. She should receive respect because she is a human being. Nobody spoke. Margaret wiped her eyes. Daniel continued. My father died 12 years ago. Since then, my mother has spent most of her time helping people who cannot repay her. She never tells them who she is. She doesn't want recognition. He looked at Emily. And today, the only person who defended her was someone who had no idea she was connected to me. Emily's eyes filled with tears. Richard quietly said, "Sir, I made a mistake." Daniel looked at him. "Yes, you did." Richard waited. Daniel said, "But the biggest mistake would be pretending nothing happened." He turned toward the staff. "Everyone here deserves to work in an environment where respect matters." Then he looked at Emily. "Would you come with me for a moment?" Emily hesitated. "Am I in trouble?" Daniel smiled for the first time. "No." They walked toward a quiet corner. Daniel said, "I want to offer you a position." Emily blinked. "A position?" "Yes. Customer Relations Coordinator for the hotel group." Emily shook her head. "I don't have a business degree." "I didn't ask about your degree." "What did you ask about?" "I watched what you did when you thought nobody important was watching." Emily looked at him. Daniel continued, "People can teach you business. They can teach you accounting. They can teach you management. But they can't easily teach someone to care." Emily looked toward Margaret. "She reminded me of my grandmother." Margaret smiled. Daniel nodded. "Then your grandmother raised you well." Emily smiled sadly. "She did." Margaret slowly approached them. "Emily." "Yes, ma'am." Margaret took Emily's hand. "Would you sit with me for tea?" Emily laughed softly. "Of course." Daniel watched them sit together. For the first time in years, he saw his mother laughing with someone she had just met. And something inside him changed. That evening, Daniel sat with his mother in the hotel lounge. "Why didn't you tell me what happened?" Margaret smiled. "Because you would have come running." "I did come running." "I know." She laughed. Daniel looked at her. "Mom, you don't have to handle everything alone." Margaret's smile faded. "I know, but I wanted to see whether people would still be kind if they didn't know my name." Daniel looked across the room at Emily. And Margaret followed his gaze. "I think I found my answer." The next morning, Emily arrived at the restaurant expecting to be told that her employment had ended. Instead, she found Daniel waiting for her. He handed her a folder. "What is this?" "Your new employment agreement." Emily opened it. Her eyes widened. "You're serious?" "Very." She looked at the salary. "Mr. Lewis, this is too much." Daniel smiled. "Then think of it differently." "How?" "Don't think of it as payment for yesterday." He paused. "Think of it as an opportunity to help us build a workplace where yesterday doesn't happen again." Emily nodded slowly. "I'll do my best." "I know." Months passed. Emily became one of the most respected employees in the company. She helped redesign the hotel's customer service program. She created a system allowing elderly customers and people with mobility difficulties to receive extra assistance without feeling embarrassed. She also started a small community meal program through the hotel, providing free meals every weekend to elderly people living alone. Margaret became one of its first volunteers. Every Saturday morning, she and Emily would sit together, serving meals and talking with guests. Eventually, Margaret admitted something to Emily. "You know, when I first entered that restaurant, I was afraid." "Afraid?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because wealth can make people suspicious of your intentions. I wanted to know whether someone would treat me kindly without knowing who I was." Emily smiled. "And now," Margaret looked around the room. "Now I know there are still good people." One Saturday, Daniel arrived unexpectedly. He watched his mother helping an elderly man carry his meal to a table. Then he looked at Emily. "You changed her life." Emily shook her head. "No, she changed mine." Daniel smiled. "Maybe that's what kindness does." Emily looked at the room filled with people eating, laughing, and talking. She remembered the rainy afternoon when Margaret had walked into the restaurant carrying nothing but an old handbag and a quiet dignity. She remembered how easily someone had judged her. And she remembered one simple truth her grandmother had taught her. Never measure a person's worth by what they appear to have. Years later, Emily became the director of community hospitality for Daniel's company. But whenever someone asked how she got the opportunity, she never mentioned the billionaire CEO. She simply said, "I saw someone being treated unfairly, and I decided not to look away." Because sometimes courage doesn't look like standing in front of a crowd. Sometimes it looks like standing beside one lonely person. Sometimes kindness doesn't bring money, fame, or success. Sometimes it simply reminds another human being that they matter. And sometimes, the person you choose to defend when nobody is watching turns out to be connected to an opportunity that changes your life. But that isn't the real lesson. The real lesson is that you should never be kind because someone might be powerful. Be kind because someone might be hurting. Be respectful because everyone deserves dignity. And speak up when you see someone being humiliated, even if your voice shakes. Because you never know whose life your kindness might touch. And you never know how far one small act of courage can travel. If this story touched your heart, remember Emily's choice the next time you see someone being ignored, judged, or treated unfairly. A few kind words may seem small to you, but to someone else, they could mean everything. If you enjoyed this emotional story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes that kindness still matters. Because in a world that often asks, "What can this person do for me?" be the person who asks, "What can I do to make this person's day a little better?" Sometimes, that is how ordinary people create extraordinary change.